All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Power Talks podcast. Today we have Coach Kyle, and he is a Tier X coach from Equinox in Miami, Florida. Introduce yourself to the camera and explain to us what Tier X means.
I've been with Equinox for almost 6 years now. Got my start in Boston. I was there for 5 years. The tier system within Equinox indicates experience level, credentialing, continuing education. Equinox does a great job of promoting from within and growing their coaches through continuing education and workshops and things that you do outside of just training clients and hitting numbers. For Tier X specifically, it was now rebranded as Coach X. I mean, doesn't really mean a whole lot other than just a marketing standpoint. But what we focus on is outside of the 1 hour session, that you see me once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. We're working on habits, skills, practices, and actions that are based around regen, so sleep, stress management, nutrition coaching, such as, maybe we're tracking our macronutrients, maybe we are focusing on nutrition timing, maybe it's stuff like just drinking enough water and getting electrolytes. So we try to take a full holistic approach of everything that encompasses fitness and boil it down to three pillars of movement, nutrition, and regeneration, and make sure we have habits built around each one of them that we're checking in on outside of session, maybe at the end of the week or the beginning of the week, seeing how they're doing and modifying as we go so that we're not just focused on, all right, you did 5 more pounds on the bench press this week. That's awesome. Let's move on.
Okay. So like
I
in
think that's
terms of,
beautiful. I think,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I was
Well,
gonna say, I think that's beautiful because a lot of gyms, whether it's group fitness or personal trainers, it is like just that hour that you're there. And so taking that time to check in throughout the week is something I could definitely get better at. And most trainers out there who are not consistently, reaching out to their clients and setting up those habits outside of the gym. Because that's like, a lot of the game is what you're doing outside of that 1 hour.
100%. And like, they always say, right, like you can't out train a bad diet, right? The gym is just a small part of your day, right? So you have, what is it, 168 hours in the week, and you see me for 3 of those hours, and you expect the world to move just during those 3 hours. Like, it's just not realistic. It might make some difference, from a baseline perspective, but until you start to peel back the layers of, what their lifestyle is, what their overall habits are, then that's when you really start to find like the meaningful, impactful change that's going to last longer than like 6 months, a year, whatever their short term goal is. And like I've got, a reminder on my phone for 4 p.m. on Fridays to check in with all the people I need to check in with to make sure that I keep myself accountable too, you know?
and as well as the accountability, what type of assessments do you guys do? Because I know that they have the in-body assessments and other things like that for clients, like the mobility checklist. What does Tier X offer in that sense?
Yeah, so we obviously, like you said, we do a body scan. We phased out the in-body. We're doing something called STIKU now, which is just infrared scanning, circumference measurements. At all coach levels, they do the mobility assessment, questionnaire, heart rate and blood pressure, and the body scan. At the Tier X, the Coach X level, we dive a little deeper. We will do resting metabolic assessments. We will do VO2 max assessments. We may do extra mobility and stability assessments, such as testing for, stability and mobility of the shoulders and hips to dive a little deeper than what the functional movement screening might do. And we also have different questionnaires, such as nutrition lifestyle questionnaire from Precision Nutrition. That's, I want to say it's like 45 questions of like, when do you usually eat? When you're bored or when you're hungry? When do you usually snack on unhealthy food? When you're stressed or when you're not stressed? And also regen questionnaires on sleep habits. And we really dive deeper into just like, yeah, I only get 6 hours of sleep. That sucks. All right, moving on, you know? So we really try to dive in here.
Can you talk
Yeah.
about that? Can you talk about the new screening that you're using? because I've heard of in body. Did you switch because of lack of consistency, or what was that? What has that been like?
Yeah. Yeah. So funny enough, when I left Boston back in August, we were using InBody, but we had just been delivered the new Spyku, the infrared scan. However, that was already installed here about 6 months prior. And the main reason why they've gone away from that is they found a lot of issues with the way InBody scans. So the InBody uses something called a bioelectric impedance analysis, very similar to how a Apple Watch measures your heart rate. It sends a soft current through the body to measure stuff like water, body fat, muscle mass, because those respond differently to electrical stimulus. The main issue they found was there was issues when it came to how hydrated you were that day. If you had a lot of salty food that night before, you're going to be a little more bloated. So there was issues with testing accuracy if we didn't eliminate those variables. So the Staiku machine, you stand on it, it'll rotate you 360 degrees and take an infrared scan of the major segments of the body: the arms, shoulders, chest, neck, waist, legs. And it is far more accurate using the circumference measurements in order to interpret, all right, how much of this is body fat, how much of this is muscle mass. We've done comparisons between the Staiku and are you familiar with like DEXA scans?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the DEXA scan is like the gold standard, like the most accurate possible metric we can use for muscle mass and body fat percentage. They found, with the Staiku, depending on the person, it's within 2 to 5% accuracy person to person. So it's about as close as you can get without having I can't even tell you how expensive the DEXA scan machine is, but it's tens of thousands of dollars that Equinox is not going to, just place into the hundreds of clubs they have.
And it's a big machine, right? The DEXA scan, it's a massive machine.
Yeah, it's like an MRI machine. If you ever seen videos of it, it's like you're laying on a table and you've got an archway going over you and it's scanning your body up and down. It's a big footprint. The Staiku takes up about, I want to say the footprint is 14 inches. So it fits
Oh,
in a
that's
small room.
nothing. Oh, that's nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you like how you stand on it and it scans the whole body, or how is it? You lay
Yeah.
down? Scan.
You're standing on it. So it's a
Okay.
platform. You stand on it, it tells you where to put your feet. It's connected to a computer screen, and there is a tower that has a camera in it. The platform rotates, and the tower has the camera technology in it, and that will start to take photos. It creates this like 3D avatar, where we can start to pinpoint, like, hey, your right arm is zero point 0.3 inches bigger in your right bicep than your left bicep, right? And that may not seem significant in the moment, but then they say like, oh, my left shoulder always really bothers me, and when I do, barbell overhead press, and maybe that's because hey, that smaller circumference on that left side is causing you to use your right side more, right? And we start to pinpoint where those imbalances really lie.
So that's how you structure. I imagine that's how you can structure your training program then for your clients by seeing where they're deficient, where they've got imbalances, and like what's going on from side to side. So is that like
Yeah.
do you use that as a main roadmap?
Yeah, we use that especially at the baseline measurements and to infer, maybe where the root cause may be. But then again, it is a baseline measurement. So we still need to do some extra mobility testing, whether it's shoulders, hips, to really pinpoint exactly where that may be. Because, some of those, for example, some of those shoulder muscles that produce a lot of stability aren't very big. So they're not going to show up in a scan like that. But at least what it does is give us an idea of like maybe which side is the problem and start to focus on where the restrictions may lie underneath that.
Okay. So
And so with that, then, do you go about handling those imbalances of more of like a joint by joint muscle approach, or do you dive into the fascial lines as well?
It's a little bit of both, to be honest with you, because when we look at, for example, like when we look at fascial lines, it allows us to understand which muscles and which groupings kind of work together, right? And
Hmm.
how they can produce force in maybe like a transverse plane or a sagittal plane or a frontal plane. We use those as balancing those planes of motion and understanding which ones should work together. And then from a joint by joint perspective, when we look at joint angles, it allows us to understand exactly where our muscles should be firing and maybe where their form is starting to break down, right? So if we lack, say, external rotation on our left side and we're doing something like a lat pull down, right? We might feel our right side lats firing like crazy, but we don't really feel our left side, right? And that might be because we can't externally rotate to get our shoulder in the proper position so that our shoulder blade can rotate properly. So when we look at the joint by joint approach, if say our left arm is super compressed and our right arm is at a right angle where we want it to be, that allows us to pinpoint, all right, we're not getting into our external rotators because we have too much elbow flexion here. And that elbow flexion is causing the bicep and the shoulder to roll forward.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, especially I like to use the integrative approach, and I do find that like when you have the integrated approach, you also have to know the joint by joint so that you can understand all those little nuances, because in the end of the day, movement isn't always going to be perfect, but if you understand the little nuances of the elbow, the knee, the hip, the femur rotation and all that. I mean, it is integrated in the end of the day, but you don't understand integration until you have piece by piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, we're all our own special little snowflake, right? We're not robots. Everyone is different, right? So every exercise that we do may look different on different people depending on how long their femurs are, how long their arms are, right? Things that we don't have control over, like their skeletal system. But if we understand joint angles and we understand how muscles should be firing, then at that point we can really pinpoint where the main issues are across the whole spectrum of people, not just certain individuals.
100%. So one thing that I'm pretty interested in knowing about is your athletic background, because I believe you told me you played golf, was it?
Yeah, golf and baseball were my primary sports. So a lot
Okay.
of rotation in both
Yeah.
of those, obviously.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about how not just your sport, but how it translated into training and some of the little things that you went along the way, like the things that the strategies that you developed over the time that you played, and how that translates into your coaching language and how you approach coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to forget sometimes that not everyone, not all my clients, I should say, grow up playing sports because it's very easy to just assume, I started playing sports when I was 4 years old, as I'm sure you guys did in some capacity, right? And some of our clients might be not in that realm at all. They may not have any exposure to that until they're in their 20s and start to try to figure out, how well their body moves, right? So it's an interesting perspective shift away from assuming that everyone knows what I'm talking about when it comes to, coaches yelling at you and, squish the bug with the foot and some of the nomenclature that you're familiar with hearing for, decades, right? In my experience, baseball was my main sport for the primary reason of I was always a skinnier kid. I was always a little behind the curve when it came to growth. I mean, I got lucky and ended up over 6 foot eventually, but it took me until college to get there, So I was a late bloomer. So I found that playing baseball was the easiest way to play sports without having that be a limiting factor. So my primary position at the beginning was a pitcher, right? And as a pitcher, especially as a lefty, being a pitcher is a huge advantage as a lefty because it creates a lot of different spin and a different angle that which the batter sees the ball, right? And I had various pitching coaches over the years that would teach me technique, form, where my foot should land, where my elbow should be, all of that kind of stuff. But I didn't really start to get into the weight training until I was about 15 years old. Once I started doing that, once I started going into the gym, I understood very quickly of how to increase my strength, increase my power without sacrificing, my how much I can whip the ball from my shoulder and my elbow, right? I knew based on just seeing my friends work out how far behind I was just naturally. So that created a lot of drive in me to work a lot longer, a lot harder on those basic things that might come easier to other people. I was working a lot on trying to get my upper body stronger, trying to get my core stronger, work on my rotational power and, getting all of those components to fit nicely into the sport that I was trying to play. And between my junior and senior season of baseball, I put on about 15 pounds of muscle just from purely strength training alone. And from that point, that allowed me to perform infinitely better at the point where I was supposed to be than where I was just doing, pitching lessons and going to practice and going home and not really doing any of that extra work. And then,
So
high
that's
school ends. I wasn't going to college, so
yeah.
that was kind of it for baseball. You know?
I feel that. And one thing that's interesting is I know Brett played baseball. I know Brett played baseball and
Yeah, dude, I started playing baseball at 3 and I played all the way through high school.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, what were you gonna say, Andrew? What were you about to say? Because I
well,
have the question as well.
swimming as well is like it has a lot of those components of getting the shoulder, being able to get the shoulder back and whip. So
Yeah,
one thing that we did a lot of was we did a lot of external rotation with the shoulder, like doing weighted external rotations. And
yeah.
I brought this into my training now, but a lot of like holding the weight and like letting my
Hmm.
shoulder go back, holding a cable, and then just like exploding off. And then that's helped a lot with like with like the fluidness of how I'm able to get into a stroke.
Oh, yeah. Well, and just in general life, we spend most of our life internally rotated. I can feel myself right now sitting down, you know, hunching over, letting the shoulders come forward. So it's not even like everyone can use more of it. It's not even just a sport thing. We just notice it as athletes because we're exposed to it at an earlier age.
100%. And so something like Goda, for example, like I know they talk a lot about a lot of their people were baseball people, so they talk a lot about the feet creating that rotation, planting the foot into the floor in order to create rotation from the hips. And
Yeah.
so like is have you ever like familiarized yourself with that with Goda or with any of like the movement people?
I'm not familiar with that one specifically, but I have studied a lot of the biomechanics of, say how pitchers or NFL quarterbacks produce force and produce power, right? It's all about, like you said, starting the rotation from the hip. We need a good amount of access to hip internal rotation so that we can begin that process of transferring the power from the ground through the legs into the core so that the core can create that rotational power. And then there's also a concept of like hip and shoulder separation. So there's a great video on Netflix of, I don't know if you saw, they did quarterbacks where they followed quarterbacks through the season, I believe last year or the year prior. And there's a whole scene of Patrick Mahomes working with his trainer. And basically, all they're trying to do is increase the separation from his right shoulder to his left hip pointer so that he can create more length through his core and start to create more torque as he fires his arm through. And
Pretty
a
cool.
lot of their training looks kind of unconventional and weird, but then they're doing also the absolute basics of like they're still doing squat, bench, deadlift. They're still doing sprints and unilateral and bilateral work. They're just really specifying on that hip and shoulder separation.
So one question I have is when it comes to strengthening for sports and even life, right? So in martial arts specifically, a lot of guys use calisthenics and they get super strong. And it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like the punching power, the kicking power will be just as strong as someone who can bench squat 400 pounds. And it's a really interesting concept. What's your take on that, on the calisthenics versus the weight training? Not that one is necessarily better than other, but but it's interesting how you can be able to produce that amount of force just using the body weight versus an external load.
Yeah, and I think that, like you said, one's not necessarily better than the other, but it's all about application and what you're trying to use it for. And I think that what happens with martial arts and anything that is based on your own body is with calisthenics, you are able to create a lot of internal tension because there are no other external forces that are influencing you, right? Like if you have, a bench press and you got two dumbbells in your hand, you don't have to stabilize too hard because you have contralateral weight and you have weights that are moving symmetrical to each other, right? So the calisthenics allows us to create a lot of internal tension and understand where we can and cannot create tension within our body. That being said, doesn't mean that you can't do some rotational work on, say, a landmine, cable, bands, whatever the case may be. But I think specifically for martial arts, starting in that calisthenics route and understanding your body and where you have limitations and imbalances will streamline that process a lot better than if you're just like, all right, I'm going to go into the gym and throw around as much weight as I can, and I hope it works, and I hope I don't get injured, because then that's a bad path to go down.
Yeah, I like what you said about kind of starting there because with a lot of youth athletes that I work with, that's where we'll start is body weight calisthenics type to get that awareness of the movement and of the body before loading, with a kettlebell, dumbbell, bar, whatever it may be, with the external load.
Yeah, and it creates that proprioception, and that's like
Hmm.
your knowledge of your body in space, right? Like you have to know if you're doing a pull up, a push up, even some of the more complicated stuff like long lever planks and planches and handstands and those kinds of things. You got to know like my hands are on the ground, but like where are my feet? Where's my pelvis? What am I engaging here to stay stable? Those are the things that are lacking when it comes to external loading.
100%. And that's something that I talk about a lot. I've been coaching youth athletes at the moment. And one thing that I talk
Awesome.
to them a lot is their connection between each part of their body. So learning how to produce force without the external cueing. That's what I call weights external cues because they tell
Yeah.
your body to produce force, but in sports, you don't necessarily have the luxury of having something in your hand, having something on your back to tell you to produce that force. You have to use the body to do it. Like I coach a few volleyball players and I coach a baseball kid. And with the volleyball
Nice.
players, they're young females, and they have the hardest time of throwing their arms into the floor to produce force. They approach things very lightly. So it's the whole mission is teaching them how to put force into the ground in order to come up, like aggressive approaches and stuff like that.
Yeah, and using the tools that you already have, right? And learning how to hone those before you start to search externally, right? The
100%.
worst thing in the world that you can do is start to load someone when they're not ready for it. And then they either get hurt or they don't make the progress that they want. And then they have this preconceived notion set into their brain of, oh, this doesn't work, so I'm never going to do it again. And they just kind of toss it in the garbage.
That sounds like functional patterns.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, we could
Yeah,
go full hour on that stuff. That's a whole other rabbit hole.
pull-ups are detrimental to the human body.
Yeah, your thoracolumbar fascia cannot handle the loading of dead hanging.
Oh man, I mean that's where we get into the conversation of all right, how much is too much, right? How much knowledge is too much knowledge? Simple is sometimes better.
100%. And I mean, the thing is, one thing I preach a lot of is yes, I love learning about the body. I love reading about it, but you can't understand the body until you felt it.
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing what things should feel like during my sessions with my clients, regardless of their goal, I'm like, all right, where are you feeling this? Where are you feeling this? Are you feeling it in the right spot? If they're feeling it in the wrong spot, we tweak it, right? Because it may look good from the external perspective for me just standing there watching them, but it might not feel the way it should, right? And unless you ask those questions, you're not going to know where they're going wrong. And you might get 3 months down the road without really understanding where you went wrong.
100%. 100%. And it's interesting that it's interesting to see a lot of mindless coaching going on. Like it's detrimental not only to the client, to the coach themselves, because if we're going to talk about retention, client retention. If someone goes home feeling horrible every single day, and the next day they wake up and they can't move, they've got lower back pain, and then they go back to the session and it's not addressed on a biomechanical standpoint. Like, just having like a little bit of biomechanics knowledge allows you to fix little things that are going on.
Yeah, and just, asking the right questions, right? Understanding that's a person in front of you. Like, my favorite question to ask when a client sits down to be in a session is like, all right, how are we feeling physically? How are we feeling mentally? How are we feeling emotionally? Fill me in, And then I just kind of sit there and wait. And they'll tell me, maybe they won't tell me everything, but you got to understand that it's a real person in front of you, not a number, not a robot, not just somebody that moves for an hour and then leaves.
Let's talk a little bit more about the emotional side, because I mean, I know I've been studying like the effects on emotions on the body, and I know Brett's been reading a lot about that too recently. So talk a little bit more about the emotional side.
Yeah, I mean, you got to want to feel like you got to do it in order to do it sometimes, right? Like, you know, we're not robots at the end of the day. We are human beings and we have emotions, we have feelings, we have things that are happening outside that might be affecting us inside. And I would say one of the biggest things with, you know, growing as a coach, going through a lot of continuing education through Equinox is we didn't really learn a whole lot of, all right, this is the best program. This is the best way to progress someone. We learned a lot about the psychology of the human mind, motivational interviewing, trans theoretical model, cognitive behavioral theory, things that are used by high level coaches as motivators, as things to set up our habits outside of the gym. We don't have this knowledge of our body just without, feeling emotions behind it, right? We understand that, like I said earlier, not everyone's an athlete, not everyone's, grew up playing sports. So you got to meet them where they're at the beginning and give them an idea of how they should be feeling. I don't want you feeling like you're beat up and destroyed afterwards, because that's not going to make you motivated to come back in. you know Maybe someone's in the pre-contemplation phase of change, and they're not ready to give up their nighttime sweets or their phone at the end of the night. And you got to understand that trying to set habits around that is only going to increase their resistance against you, right? You want them to feel like you're on their team. And maybe they're not ready to give up on some things, but maybe they tell you they are ready to give up on others. And those are the things you have to focus on, because that's how you build that trust in that relationship. And if they don't trust you, if they don't think that you have their best interest at heart, and you're not showing empathy and compassion, maybe when they slip up or maybe when they don't show up one day, if they don't feel like you've got their back, then they're just going to leave and they're just going to up and quit. And maybe they don't even sign up with another trainer. Maybe they just stop trying for 6 months, and then you set them back a whole year.
Yeah. Hey, one thing I wanted to ask, and kind of switching gears a little bit, is you have a kinesiology degree, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
what would you say are the key some differences between when you went through that route and you got your degree versus your continued education outside and your own personal studies?
Yeah, so funny enough, one of my electives through kinesiology was personal training 101, taught through American College of Sports Medicine. That's my certification. Um, Through kinesiology, at first, obviously, you learn about the baseline anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, right? You understand nutrition, you understand, sedentary lifestyles and public health and how those things kind of affect the general population. And then I have all of that background. I like to use that as a background in, all right, how things should be moving and how the body should be working. But then as the continuing education, as I've gone through my experience of Equinox, I've understood, where some things help us out in terms of anatomy and physiology, and where some things just don't really flat out matter. You know, you have this idea of like, oh, every little muscle has its own name and every little muscle should be activated in X kind of way. But if you're not feeling the way the muscle should be working, or maybe you're trying to give these cues of like, I want you feeling your left external rotator in your subscapularis and your teres major, they're just going to look at you like, dude, what are you talking about? You know? And through, my continuing education, you learn how to take those broad, those complex principles and boil them down to like, all right, like let's forget everything else, right? I want you focusing on this. All I want you to do is spread the floor apart. I want you to squeeze the pencil between your shoulder blades. If you had a towel in your armpits, I don't want you to lose the towel, you know? Little things like that. If I had $100 bill under your lower back, I don't want you to let me take the $100 bill, you know? Taking those complex, I understand, I know all these muscles, I can name you all the bones, but like they don't care about that. They just care that I know it. And then how do I disseminate that information?
100%.
So with your current status, what are some things that are interesting you at this moment?
Um, I find especially having moved from the Northeast down to Miami, I find it very interesting how the demographic of people really changes depending on the climate, depending on the environment around us, right? So, like, for example, you have people where I was coaching in Boston that might be very healthy, they might have good habits, but they may not look, like they're quote unquote beach ready, right? And then on the flip side, you have people here in Miami that, look like they could be on the cover of a magazine, but then the elevator breaks in their building and they have to walk up 3 flights of stairs and they are gassed afterwards. And they are just like keeled over, puffing and puffing, can't calm down. And the duality of that is very interesting to me because it really illustrates what are the priorities in these different regions. Obviously Florida having nice weather, beaches, everyone wants to look good all the time, but they don't really care about how they feel or, how their cardiovascular system is. Whereas in Boston, it's the opposite. You have the 4 seasons. You're only having your shirt off for like maybe 3 months out of the year. So like they could care less about having a six pack. They just want to have a high VO2 max, have good mobility, and not have pain. So
That's
that
interesting.
duality is fascinating to me.
That just reminded me when you brought up VO2 max, because you said at the beginning that that's one of the things that you guys test. How do you go
Absolutely.
about what is the testing protocol for you and Equinox?
So the test itself for the VO2 max is done with a system called PNOE. They measure gas exchange. So what we do is we put them on a treadmill, right? We get set up with the mask, flow sensor, and then they wear the sensor as like a backpack. Basically, what we do with the test itself is there's a warm up period and a cool down period. In the middle, we are just increasing speed, keeping the incline the same until they gas out, right? The mask allows us to see how much gas exchange is going on. At what point do they flip between producing more CO2 versus oxygen that they can take in? Because that'll tell us a lot about how well their heart and their lungs are working, but also at what point do they stop burning fat calories and start to go to pure glycogen and carbohydrate burn. That's valuable information for things like, stress level, how well their body processes carbs versus fat, how strong their cardiovascular system is at like a steady state level versus the high intensity level. And that allows us to really pick apart what are the low hanging fruit for that person, and where can we make the biggest change first before we start to really narrow in our focus.
That's pretty cool.
It's very
So
cool. Have you went through those, Andrew? Have you done one of those personally? I've never done the full mass test.
I have
I would
not.
love to.
Andrew, I can take you through one next time you're at Brickell Heights. Just let me know.
Hey, I would
There's
love to.
some there's some protocol beforehand, like you have to be fasted, no caffeine. Like there's a protocol behind it where it's best to do in the morning just because, you don't want to go the whole day fasted like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've done VO2 testing, but our VO2 testing was extremely archaic. So what we would do in
Oh yeah.
swimming, what we would do in swimming is we'd pick a time. We'd pick it about 20% below our best time. So say my best time in the 50 free was 19 seconds. We would go, I'd have to hit 22 seconds and I would hit that until I couldn't. So it's like, say my max threshold was I hit it 3 times. So that was like my VO2 max was just like how quickly I would burn out when doing high intensity
Yeah.
effort. But it was extremely that's not scientific. That's not very scientific at all.
Yeah, well, and it's that method. It's actually more accurate than you would think. What it sounds a lot like is for some people that don't want to do the mask, we'll do what's called a modified Cooper test, and that is just 12 minutes on the treadmill at a set incline. I believe it's at a 1 or a 2 incline, and we just all right, max distance you can cover in 12 minutes. Go, right, and that'll give us a good idea within reason of around where your VO2 max is at. You just won't get any understanding of, where you started to produce more carbon dioxide, when your fat burning capability turned off, little things like that that come from the gas exchange and the flow sensor itself.
That's interesting.
I
That's
just did one 2 weeks ago and I was gassed afterwards. I had a headache the rest of the day. So it's not for the faint of heart.
I bet. I mean, I remember every time we would have our VO2 days, I was throwing up. I was throwing up. Like the amount of lactic acid and just like the
Oh
body,
yeah.
you feel that you just feel the lactic acid like coming up to your neck, like your shoulders don't even feel like they can move anymore, and you just feel uncomfortable. You feel uncomfortable
Yeah.
for
Not
sure.
for the faint of heart. And that's where the competitive athlete gets in you is like, I just one more, one more, one more, right? And that's where we start to run into that wall.
100%.
Yeah,
So
and the quality of the rep starts to deteriorate.
Yeah, like I can tell when someone's at the end of their VO2 max testing, when their gait starts to break down, their running form gets all over the place. I'll be able to hear the CO2 coming out, like I'll be able to hear their breathing rate. So there's predictors there that you can start to be like, all right, we're heading towards the end. How much do they got left?
so one thing you mentioned the gait. So how much like that's been a focus of I think both of ours recently, both Brett and I, and in our training. How much do you have some kind of gait in mind when you're training people? And does it cross your mind or no?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can tell you right now, I have this one client. I just saw her today at 1 o'clock. She has been working on getting back into running, right? And so we've been talking a lot about gait, especially the difference between walking and running, because in the gait cycle, the big difference is you have that flight phase, right? You have flight and heel strike as opposed to just, step through and heel strike. Um, and she has scoliosis, so she's always very cognizant of exactly what's going on in her body, and she doesn't want to create any issues. So she had started running again, wants to do like 5Ks and 10Ks in the fall time here in Miami. And she actually, first couple times running, she's like, yeah, like this knee is bothering me and this hip is bothering me. So we looked at her gait cycle and I actually recorded her just walking across the floor here at Equinox. And what we figured out is like one of her legs, she was reaching forward so much further than the other. So it was almost like she was walking with a limp in a way where she's just dragging one leg across. And what that told me is the side that was being dragged, we needed to strengthen that hip flexor. The side that was the longer step, we needed to strengthen her calf and her soleus muscle to be able to handle that impact. And we used that gait cycle, simply because she wanted to run. That was the reason why we looked at it. But we used that to infer, muscle imbalances and muscle weaknesses that we may not have figured out if we weren't looking through that.
And
100%.
so, what are some of the exercises and protocols that you're implementing with that situation specifically?
So for runners, you have a lot of high volume work that's done through the running, right? You're running miles and miles, you're doing a lot of steps. So the work that is done is very lower volume, but we want to try and work on loading those joints and those muscles. I can tell you from experience that a lot of avid runners will lack stability in the ankles and strength in the hamstrings. And that's what usually leads to either hip, knee, or ankle overuse type injuries. So we spend a lot of time on stuff like, isometrics where we're just holding a certain posture, or maybe we'll try to load a heavy hip flexion like on a cable or using a mini band or a kettlebell or something like that. Um, because we don't want to start to add more endurance work to what they're already doing, right? They've already got that covered. My clients don't want me to stand next to them while they're running 3 miles in the treadmill because that's just boring for both of us, right?
Yeah.
But they want to see me for that, that extra little strengthening for certain joints, for certain muscle groups that may be neglected from that continuous endurance work.
So there is
Yeah, I
one.
think isometrics are I was just I think isometrics are great for position teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just developing stability.
Yeah.
And another thing that I've seen you implement this with one or two clients. I wasn't sure, but I was seeing you do a lot of like movement with the cable, some like functional patterns looking stuff, maybe once or twice. And I wanted
Yeah.
to pick your brain a little bit more on that because I know a big part of our gait cycle is how well our shoulders relate to our hips. And like if that's something you would also add to your client's programming when she's trying to fix her gait patterning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the cables are a great instrument for loading different angles, right? And having continuous, consistent resistance where you don't have to worry about, like with the dumbbell, depending on the angle, it may feel different, landmine, machine, right? Those kinds of things. Um, Cables are a great tool, especially for that rotational work. For someone like herself, especially when you have a spinal issue, it is a great tool to teach her how to engage each side individually, right? Because, like you said, the upper body rotation is transverse motion to create linear walking, right? So it is something that we can look at as a weak link in terms of, all right, we are strengthening the legs. We're focusing so much on the stuff below the hips. What's going on above the hips as well, right? Because that is part of the running cycle at the end of the day. You're pumping your arms, you're moving everything else other than just, your head. So it is part of the running cycle. And if we can create more consistent strength and more consistent movement in the T spine, in the shoulders, when it comes to rotation, when the legs start to give out, that's what we're going to go towards if we're talking like super long distance running. Like I'll give you an example. I did High Rocks back in April. And if you're not familiar, High Rocks is like a 10K, but every kilometer you do a certain exercise and it's just brutal on the legs. Like it is killer. And there's this one exercise where you're doing a sled push for, I believe it's 200 meters and it's a 350-pound sled and your legs are just gassed afterwards. But you got to keep those legs moving because you're worried about your time. So I had a coach tell me, like, after that, just pump your arms, just move your arms as fast as you can, because that'll just get the legs moving based on, your own previous history, right? So at that point, like my legs feel like they're just jello, they are full of cement, and I still got 4 more kilometers to go. So I'm just pumping my arms as hard as I can, trying to move my shoulders to just create some sort of movement until I can get the feeling back in them.
You know what that reminds me of? The video David Weck posts this a lot. It's the one where the guy has no arms and no legs, but he's moving. So it's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. And he's
spinal
just kind of
engine
swaying
theory.
a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like the spinal
exactly. That's
engine theory
basically High
where
Rocks.
your arms and your legs are dead, so you're just a moving corpse.
You're just trying to move something, man. You're just trying to keep moving so you can continue to knock off distance and get to the finish line, you know?
So when you were training for that, let's speak a little bit about that. Like because you have to have a lot of strength endurance, you have to have a lot of endurance, and you have to have the strength factor because 350 pound sled push is not it's not easy to get moving.
Yeah, it's no joke, man. It was High Rocks was different than anything I'd ever done. I have done 5Ks, I've done Spartan races, I've done bodybuilding style training, I've trained for sports specific stuff. I've done a lot of those types of things, and High Rocks was a completely different beast. It was very much a perfect marriage of strength and endurance because it kind of taught me how to use different energy systems at different times and learn how to pace myself, especially if my heart rate is in like the 160s, 170s, 180s. Like it's easy to pace yourself on a treadmill when you're just cruising at 120, 130, 140, and you're just feeling comfortable and your favorite song's on. But when you are like getting off that sled push, or you're doing the burpee broad jump where you have to do a burpee and then jump forward for a total of 80 meters, or you're doing the farmer's carries, or any of those exercises, you're teaching yourself how to reserve energy, especially for the ones you don't feel as strong on. And so the training for it, the preparation, how I hydrated myself, how I fueled myself, started to get really into, how marathon runners fuel for long runs and how strength athletes fuel themselves for 1 rep maxes. It was a really cool kind of conjoining of those two types of training, or those two styles of exercise. And, in the moment, it's miserable. You're in the pain chamber. You are just like, all right, just like 5 more steps, just 10 more steps. But then afterwards, you're like, you feel like a king. You feel like a god. Like I just did that. I just completed that whole thing. And I run up on the stage and they're taking photos, and you just feel like all the weight of the training just lift off of you, and then it's indescribable.
When you're training for that, were you also implementing some psychological training or some methods to work on your brain and your thought process going into an event?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was definitely days of training where I was like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I doing this? I paid to do this. I signed up for this. I'm not being paid. I'm not being coerced into doing this. And we had a couple of the other coaches that were doing it with us. So I really leaned on them a lot because it was my first time. They had done it before. And that really increased like the camaraderie within our little group of, the 4 TRX trainers, including myself. But there was definitely points where I was totally out of my depth. I was, at my maximum. And it really made me appreciate the beginning stages of when I first started working out, and, maybe for some of my clients when they're at the beginning stages, because, as adults, we spend so much time doing what we know and what we're comfortable with. And then we get thrown a wrench into the plan, and then we have to adjust. And it taught me that like I have so much more capability. I'm probably going to do another one if we're being honest. If we're just talking about it candidly, we all said the same thing. We're going to do another one, but the mental work was profoundly inspiring, and I felt a renewed appreciation for what my body can do, especially having done this for being a trainer for 6 years, having done exercise for 12 years, playing sports for 20. It was a totally new experience, and I think it was definitely something that tested me.
Have you gotten into any meditation or like gratitude practices or yeah, like something like that, like a meditative state, something that or breath work even?
Yeah, absolutely. So funny enough, so at the beginning of the Coach X transition process, one of my biggest issues, when I was being tested, was my stress and how my body is processing stress. So a couple of years ago, I really started getting into breath work, doing your box breathing, your 4-7-8s, your Wim Hofs, those types of guided meditations where you're really trying to turn off that parasympathetic sympathetic tone and get yourself into more of a relaxed state. I use that stuff now to help myself wind down before bed, to help improve sleep quality, to calm myself down in stressful environments. I was doing my box breathing right before my high rocks race, because they put you in a tunnel with the speakers and they're like, welcome to the high rocks, and they start like bumping the music and your heart rate's already jacked up, so you're trying to actively bring it back down. And the guided meditation, sleep meditation, those kind of things, I've really dove into those over the last, I would say, year or two, especially kind of expanding past just fitness and nutrition and going into more of the sleep regen, stress management side of things. I've, shared that with friends. I've shared that with clients. It's helped them immensely. So I think there's a huge untapped potential in what exactly we can accomplish when it comes to those types of, mindfulness, breath work. I have a journal, gratitude journal, that kind of stuff, positive affirmation. So it's something that not a lot of people put a lot of time and respect for, but once you do, it's like your eyes just open wide.
100%. Something that I've
That's
been,
right.
what? No,
Oh no, I was
that's,
gonna say that's right along the lines of the book that we're reading, the Energy Bus. Good
yeah.
recommendation for anybody. Short, quick read. It's like almost like a story, not so much of a nonfiction, but the principles you can carry over to your life.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I'll
I
have to check
finished
that
that
out.
one about a day or two ago, and one thing that I implemented from the book, gratitude walks and positivity walks. Like it's helped me out a lot because I've been doing the meditation for about eight to 10 years now. It's
Nice.
when I really got into it. Swimming, that's something that we had to do before every practice and after every practice. Our coaches would make us visualize, and we get into this
Nice.
meditation. We do 10 minutes. So I didn't take it seriously though. When you're in college and you're in high school and the coaches are like, okay, we just finished probably the most horrible thing you've ever done, and definitely the worst part of your day. Definitely the worst
Yep.
part of your day. Let's stay longer at practice, stay longer at the pool, and let's sleep for 10 minutes basically. So in my
Yep.
head, like most of the time, most of the time was just like, I need to eat, I need to eat. So I didn't really
Yeah,
start,
you're just thinking about one thing,
yeah, and I
right?
didn't really start taking it seriously until, I mean, I was doing it, don't get me wrong. It's not like I never took it seriously, but I only really started taking it seriously about 3 years ago. When I
Okay.
joined Equinox and I started getting the guided meditations from the Equinox app.
Yeah, that's funny. Not a lot of people know that's there. And then I show it to my clients and they're like, wait a minute. I thought my app was just a check-in.
No, I
That's
love
it.
that
And
app.
I'm like, no, your program lives there. You have on-demand classes. You have, like you said, meditation. You have mobility class. You have all of this stuff that you have access to. And I would guess maybe 10%, 15% of the members actually utilize that to its fullest capacity.
Yeah, I love the bar classes. I do them in my house. Like sometimes when I just
Nice.
want to warm up before the actual workout, I have a protocol for warm up. I always warm up at home before going to the gym so that I don't spend a lot of time on the stretching mat. But
Yeah.
the Pilates classes, the bar classes, those are amazing for getting your hips going.
Oh yeah. I've taken Pilates, one-on-one on the reformer at for months on end, and I've never felt stronger and more stable in my core than when I was doing reformer Pilates once a week.
100%. And
You
you
know?
understand your body so well because they make you get everything in place and they make you like 100% lock in.
Oh man. And then you go, a week down the road, you pick up a weight and you're like, why does this feel light? Is this really 40 pounds? Like this feels like 10, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the whole idea, like what I really love about that's why I love the integrative approach to working out because you start learning how to use other parts of your body to do something that you thought a different part of your body was doing. I don't know if I
Yeah, and
explained
like
that right.
I always say to my clients, like the perfect holy trinity or whatever you want to call it is going to be some combination of Pilates, strength training, and cardio, right? When you boil everything down, right? Now that you can vary, the type of Pilates, the type of strength training, the type of cardio, like that's all fine. But if we're talking about overall health, wellness, strength, mobility, stability, all of that kind of stuff, right? The reformer, the Pilates stuff, they just get you into positions that I can't get you in, right? You're hanging upside down from your legs and you're pulling on some pulley on from your left side. Like I can't get you in that position. As good of coaching I can give you, as best language, like I can't just get you there, right? I don't have the equipment available, right? But I can do things to help complement that, right? And I can do things to help supplement what it is you're doing in the Pilates class. And I have clients that do both, and I talk to their Pilates trainer, and they're like, this week we're working on XYZ. All right, I'm going to do XYZ to complement that. Or maybe we're doing two totally different things. You know, it might be two different approaches, but they complement each other so well that it's something that I wish more people did.
I
Oh,
think that's so important. I think that's so important, having that contact with the other coaches that's in the client's program.
Yeah, we're all on the same team,
Exactly.
right? We're all trying to get client A from point A to point B, right?
but one more
And you
thing
see it,
that
you hear it talked about a lot, especially in sports teams where the S&C guy is like doing his best, but the skill coach just, put them through one of those practices that Andrew was just talking about, where it was the hardest, session they've done, and then they come to the weight room either the same day or the next day, and they're gassed, they're burnt. But if they were on the same page, it could have been a much more efficient process.
Yeah. And that's where we see injuries happen. That's where we see burnout, you know, athletes just completely quitting in general because they feel like they're not getting better when they're focusing on one specific thing, but they're not looking at everything else, right?
100%. So that going in from the topic of Pilates and all types of training, something that I've been deep diving into is the need or the detriment of having a lot of flexibility.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, what's your
Yeah. So,
perspective?
I mean, yeah. So, it's the same um, issue I'll hear sometimes of, someone comes in, they're like, I only do yoga, right? And that's awesome. Yoga is great for increasing flexibility, but there's a big difference between flexibility and mobility, right? Same thing as active range of motion and passive range of motion, right? Flexibility or passive range of motion is just how far can we stretch our muscle? And those muscle lengths can change over time depending on the demand that you put on them, right? So if you're doing yoga 5 days a week, your muscles are going to get really long and really stretched out, which is great if you lack that, right? But if you don't have that active range of motion, that mobility, or that ability to create that motion from your own body weight and from your own musculature, then you're still going to expose yourself to injuries. And a lot of times, what we see with people that do only specifically yoga is they are in increased risk of injury because they can't create that stability and that strength and that tension at those end ranges of motion. Like they can touch their toes and put their nose to their knees, but they can't handle an RDL of 20 pounds because they only feel it in their lower back and they're not able to create tension within that muscle, right? So it's again, it's a balance of everything, right? And that muscle length and that flexibility doesn't mean that they automatically have access to that range of motion.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've spoken to Julian about. He's a Joel Seedman guy, and so
Mr. 90 degrees.
Mr. 90 degrees. So I do have my qualms with 90 degrees because I don't think it's whether it might be optimal for a certain group of people or for people that do have extreme cases of pain and they don't actually have the form or the technique to go below that. But I will say for the yoga people, having too much flexibility, they can't create that contraction within their muscles to actually feel it. So it's
Right.
like the flexibility is needed to do an RDL, but how much is too much to the point where contraction doesn't get used?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about how much is too much, right? It goes back to what we were just talking about with the balance, right? If you're only doing yoga, say 5 days a week, that's fine for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. But if you don't start to integrate complementary movements to whatever it is you're trying to accomplish with your flexibility, then you're just creating another problem down the road, right? Like I've got nothing against if you're rehabbing from an injury, say in your knee, for example, and you can't really load up your legs, but you don't want to stop moving, then go ahead and do yoga. Be careful with it, right? Don't load it up too much. Don't risk re-injuring yourself and trying to balance on that one bad leg. But once that does start to feel better, then start to load it again, then start to increase that strength and that resistance profile, because at the end of the day, you need that strength for overall longevity, health, wellness. And on the flip side, the whole 90-degree stuff, like that might be great, like you said, for a certain group of people that are maybe super elite athletes that are getting a ton of movement and a ton of stress on their joints on a daily basis, and they can't handle any more than just like 90 degrees. But at the end of the day, they're going to create a deficit for themselves down the road, right? They're not going to be able to maybe bend over and pick up their kids in 10 years because they lack the ability to hinge from the hips past, whatever their 90 degrees is.
And another thing too is the external rotation of the shoulders, because I mean, if you see a Cedarman guy bench, they're never getting into here. And so I've watched a lot of their running patterns, and they don't have that swing component to the shoulder to where they really get down and do that double pump in order to get into the other side, because their external, or their, yeah, it's internal rotation of their shoulders is not
Internal, yeah.
there. Yeah, it's not there. So they have a lot of stability, but they don't have that, like, that how do you say it? That fluidness, the fluidity.
Yeah, like things aren't connected. Things are just moving independent of each other, right? Because you got to be careful with someone who preaches a philosophy that only works with like elite athletes, because we forget that genetics is such a huge driver of performance, right? Like there are some people that are just as fair as unfair may be, that are just built different, that are born different than us, right? Like you see some of the best NFL athletes, Tyreek Hill, Chad Ochocinco, eating McDonald's every day, you know? And meanwhile, you're sitting
Yeah.
there tracking your macros, weighing your food, getting 8 hours of sleep, taking all the supplements under the sun. That gap is always going to be there no matter what, right? So you always got to be careful of those people that only coach elite athletes, because they are working from such a higher floor, such a higher baseline than 95, 98% of the people that exist in this world.
100%. 100%. And another thing that I love to talk about is the lack of biomechanical focus in yoga, because I mean, yes, there's a lot of biomechanics that go into yoga, but one thing that I did yoga a lot. I did it 5 days a week for a few years. I never stopped strength training though. But one thing
Good.
was, like, knee angles, joint angles, you're going way past what is considered optimal on a regular basis. And if you don't have, like, for example, just think about a warrior two position. And if you're really getting into that other knee, you see a lot of ankles collapse in order to allow the knee to go over the toe. You
Yep.
see hips being turned and not exactly leveled, because people are just trying to get into range rather than focusing on the little nuances of like each part of the joint and each joint. So it just creates a
Yeah.
lot
And,
of,
and I would say, yeah, I would say that that's where we start to get into the conversation of like too much, right? Because we're sacrificing the angle or the stability or the mobility of one joint to access more range in another, right? It's the same thing as like when people can't squat to depth, they just bring their legs out super wide into like a sumo stance, and then they can hit 90 degrees, but they are just totally outside of their shoulder width, and they're not going to be nearly as strong or stable in that position.
100%. 100%. So pivoting off of the yoga and 90 degrees, we've got a massive topic in training, which is rotation, and the idea of a core being neutral, spine being neutral. But in most sports, that's not the case. And just in walking is not the case. So how do you go
Right.
about implementing that without, because maybe you talk to your clients about it, but how do you go about it, introducing it without introducing it?
Yeah, because you'll have those clients that they come in, they have a bad back, or they have a bad shoulder, or a bad hip, or a bad knee, right? And you'll have some resistance from them. You'll have some, they're scared, right? Some fear in there own ability to perform at a certain motion. So they're super aware, super cognizant of like, they're always looking in the mirror, making sure their back is straight, even if they're just standing there, right? And they're always trying to make sure that they're not putting themselves at risk. And maybe they buck against you when it comes to introducing new movements or new tools. And I think that if we're talking about Gen Pop and we're talking about most people, right, they are going to find immense value in learning how to rotate under load in a stable fashion. They're going to learn a lot about their body on how to flex from the spine, but still not feel pain and feel strong from there. But you have to start small, right? You have to start with baby steps with those people. And within those conversations, that's where some of that motivational interviewing starts to come into play. It's like, what are you ready, willing, and able to do at this present moment? And if we understand why we're implementing this, we can understand further as to why we are trying to put you into this position. And maybe at the beginning, it's just unloaded and it's just them feeling comfortable and confident there and building up that trust. But at the end of the day, it's going to be something that everyone benefits from. And it's going to be, whether it's loading rotation or maybe it's loading anti-rotation, right? And getting into, the conversation of stability versus rotational power. Regardless of what their purpose is, as long as you tie it back to what their goals are, what their why is for being there, and how it's going to help them down the road. If you've already built that trust, then they're not going to really hesitate to put that in. It's just going to be a question of when are they ready.
When it comes to the anti-rotation for you, when do you implement that?
So like for my clients and for myself personally, I find that trying to implement pure rotation and anti-rotation within the same hour can be difficult at the beginning. So a lot of times we will pick specific days of like, today we're doing isometrics and today we're doing anti-rotation. So Palloff press, any kind of static hold, any isometrics in that plane of motion to teach them how to be strong and stable first. And then we'll do a separate day, maybe down the road, maybe in that same week, depending on how ready they are and maybe what their sense of urgency is. And then purely focus on absolute rotation and power. Typically, we'd be at the beginning of the session so that we can get it while we're the most fresh and before we've fatigued other muscles. But I do like to separate the two on different days of the week just so that we can really hone in on exactly where we should be feeling it, where our deficiencies are. But I do always start with like anti-rotation, anti-flexion to teach them how to create stability first, just to reduce that risk of injury and reduce them from going all gung-ho on a cable rotation with way too much weight and throwing their back out.
So for a individual who is, they could be athlete or they could be general population doing athletic things like golf. So they're
Yeah.
getting in a lot of that rotation. Do you think that the anti-rotation is helping them since it's a new, you could say a new form of strength, or do you think it's detrimental since it's patterning straight rather than what they're going to do when they swing the golf club?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that as a novel stimulus, right, as a new thing, creating stability first will allow them to know how to activate those muscles. But then it's really about, you talk about patterning, it's about what you do more often, right? So if you figure out where they are deficient first through static stability and through isometrics, then you can understand where to really load them more down the road, right? Because we're not trying to create stiffness, we're just trying to create awareness of where the body should be working. So if they are, say, golfer, baseball player, hockey player, tennis player, whatever the case may be, if they're doing some sort of rotation in sports, they're going to do more rotational power and more loaded rotational work. But at the beginning, they may need to be taught where the tension needs to be created before we go down that route.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that as well. It's good. Yeah, it's good because a lot of people don't have that awareness.
Yeah, and sometimes they think that, all right, let me just add more weight and then I'll feel it. And then they get to a point where they're not doing the right thing and they throw their back out or they hurt themselves some way, somehow. And then you got to start all the way back from ground zero.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a huge fan of using lighter weights to feel exactly where you want to go. And then whenever you're with the heavier weight, you want to feel the same thing you felt with the lighter weight, just a little bit more intense.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, one cue I heard a long time ago, but it always stuck with me was make the lightweight feel heavy so the heavyweight feels light.
Love that one. That's a great one. Because
Yeah.
even, I tell this to my clients, even the biggest bodybuilders in the world use the 10-pound dumbbells. Even the best athletes in the world use the lightweight. They just know how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and being able to create that pressure within yourself, like, making that lightweight feel heavy, creating that internal pressure. Then when you get to the heavier load, it's not like a surprise because you're already teaching the body to essentially feel that before you ever load it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to the psychological aspect too of them understanding their body and them knowing where they should be activating and where they should be feeling and allowing them to create some of that intrinsic motivation and that internal trust in I know I can do this because I've done this with a lower risk exercise. So now I can trust that I can do more with my body.
Yeah, and that's something we were just talking about on another episode where we were talking about. I think it was Eldoa. So we were talking about, I think it was what, yeah, that when we were mentioning Eldoa, we were talking about doing something like that or doing like fascia work or whatever you want to call it, but just doing something that is creating an awareness throughout multiple parts of the body, you could say. Well, in turn, if you're going for that hypertrophy that bodybuilding type training will give you more of that awareness throughout the body that you can then use.
Yeah. And like at the end of the day, a 15-pound dumbbell can be as effective as a 50-pound dumbbell. It just depends on application, right? And intention, right? And if you're just going through the motions and you're not really focusing on what you're doing, and you're just like, I got 20 minutes before I got to hop on this call, so let me just do as many things as I can, that's when you're going to start to run into some real risk. So having that intention of this time I'm doing this is going to be so much more powerful than the volume of stuff you get through.
And also another thing that I've found is once you really understand how to use the body, any exercise, it applies to every exercise, and you find yourself being able to make a stimulus range throughout multiple and endless exercises because you just understand how to use the body and how to activate certain things.
Yeah. And that's where, like, I find it very interesting, especially in commercial gyms, being here. I know a lot of people in this gym, but they'll come up to me and be like, oh, what are you doing with that smaller weight? And like your ego starts to get involved of like, maybe I should be pushing heavier weight because this guy said so. Or maybe, I'm just doing chest press. Maybe I should be trying to just max it out as much as possible. It's like, dude, if you hear someone say like, "Oh, you should be going heavier," then they may not know exactly what it is they should be talking about,
Sounds
because
like
then it's
Brandon.
like, all right, well, why? Well,
That sounds like
everyone
Brandon.
has their own philosophy, and Brendan is very, very capable in what he coaches his clients, and he makes sure that those clients are ready for loading heavy. Right, that's the big difference. Right,
Yeah,
he makes sure that he does all the necessary work before he does that. Whereas some coaches that might not know what they're talking about might load them up right away and just be like, "All right, let's see what happens."
Do you think
I'm
there's a certain point where you shift gears in the training? Like if we're always just overloading, 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 I mean, you get really strong. Like, is there a certain point where you switch gears, or do we just always keep pushing up the weight?
I mean, that's where science comes into play, man. Like we talk about, what is their overall why, right? What is their goal? Like their goal might be, all right, I want to get stronger, right? Well, why do you want to get stronger? Like, oh, well, I always felt like I was weaker. I always felt like I wasn't, the biggest kid, or I always felt like I wasn't this or I wasn't that. Okay, that's your motivation right there, right? So we're going to continue to get stronger, and like you said, push load maybe over 2, 3, 4, 6 month, cycle. But then at that point, we got to reevaluate like what it is we're really doing this for, right? We gained all this strength. Now, what are we using it for? Are we trying to pick up our kids and put them on our shoulders? Are we trying to go into a powerlifting competition? Are we trying to just live our lives and be, a normal person, right? That's when we start to shift our focus, and maybe we don't increase load week over week, month over month, but we increase volume, or we increase time under tension, or maybe we shift the focus to pure endurance, or maybe performance, power, speed. Like there's different energy systems and there's different adaptations that we can really target. We just have to understand why we're in the gym spending this time and who we have in front of us.
Yeah, it's the most important thing. Everyone is an individual, so assessing what their goals are is, of course, going to be the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no one size fits all, right? Some people hit a plateau just because, that's their like biological limit. And then you have to understand, all right, how can I challenge this person in a different way? Right? Maybe it's novelty, maybe it's changing up the frequency, or the time under tension. There's a million different ways you can go about that. You just got to understand and talk to the person that's in front of you, and know where they're coming from.
And in the end of the day, you're the architect of a sculpture, and there's so many little nuances that you have to work around and constantly adapt, or for some people they're just like the perfect client where there's really just like they're coming in, they know so much and they're just giving you the answers to the test. Like,
Yeah, some people are open books, right? Some people will tell you everything you need to know after you just asking them one question, right? Some people you got to dig in a little bit, and then that might not be 1 hour, that might be 1 week or a month until they start to trust you enough to dive down deeper. It actually reminds me, my favorite quote of all time is, man cannot recreate himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor, right? So change is
write that
painful.
down.
Change is always going to be painful. Yeah,
Wait,
Alexis Carrel.
repeat that again. I'm writing it down.
Man cannot recreate himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor. It's by an author. Her name is Alexis Carrel. And it perfectly illustrates the point of fitness, where it's not always going to be comfortable. Change is always going to be hard. We're not going to like it sometimes. But if we have this idea of who we should be, it's in the marble somewhere. We just have to spend the time chiseling it out.
100%. I like that. So on the topic of literature, what are some of the best, some of your favorite books that you've read along the way, whether that helped you in fitness, but that were maybe about the body, or maybe about other things that allowed you to tie these concepts in.
Yeah. So I mean, the biggest fitness, lifestyle, nutrition, longevity, whatever you want to call it, book that I've read that has completely reshaped how I train myself, how I view training, how I train my clients, is a book called Outlive by Dr. Peter Attia. I'm sure everyone knows that one. Yeah, I'm sure he's got the book right there. I've got it hardcover at home, and I've got it on Audible,
Right
right?
here.
Nice.
Yeah. Yep, yep,
Yeah, you,
yep.
you recommended it to
Um,
me.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Yeah. I've recommended it to all my clients. Many of them have read it and have reread it, right? Peter Attia, he has a podcast called The Drive. I probably listen to it maybe once a week. He is a, Johns Hopkins trained medical doctor who worked in the field for decades, and really started to pilot this idea of how do we take our health and wellness into our own hands, and not just look for band-aid solutions of prescriptions and treating the symptoms, rather treating the root cause, right? He calls it medicine 3.0, right? Where 1.0 is just figuring out, what are medications that help. 2.0 is how do we prescribe them to people and treat band-aid solutions. But 3.0 is where we start to figure out, all right, in my 20s, I need to make sure I strength train, I do my cardio, I do my mobility work, so that when I am 80, I have access to these muscles and I have access to using that strength so I can live a normal life, because they talk about the difference between lifespan and health span, where lifespan is just how many years you live. Health span is how well you live, especially that terminal decade that he calls it, those last 10 years. Like, are you up and moving around and going on hikes and doing the things you enjoy, or are you bedridden, being kept alive by medications and machines and the kindness of other people, right? So I think those are hugely helpful for looking at fitness as a holistic approach for just about anyone that wants to improve their overall like quality of life, you know. For outside of just pure health and wellness, I've read a lot of books on psychology, on gratitude and mental preparation. Like you have your David Goggins books, Can't Hurt Me and Never Broken, where it's just like, be hard, like don't feel pain, right? And that's good and all for some people to just like kind of get them moving. And then you have other books, like I just finished one called The Let Them Theory by Mel Robbins, that's all about not letting other people, control your mood and control the way you perceive things and process things. And it's a very passive approach of not allowing the energy of others to influence you. But if I had to pick like just one specifically that I go back to on a yearly, monthly basis, it's two books by a guy named Mark Manson. It's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Apologize if I'm not allowed to curse. And Everything is Fuck, A Story of Hope. Because what those really dove into was life lessons from different perspectives, from different people, on what are some of the normal things that we kind of go through as human beings. Why do we feel that way? And how can we learn from these things? Because he has a very like straightforward kind of cut through the BS approach of, yeah, yep, 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 yep. Oh yeah. And then the orange cover on the other one.
Yeah, I
Iconic.
gave that one to my sister.
Yep. I've recommended that one to anyone that will ask. And the overwhelming feedback that I've gotten on that one has just been like, dude, I didn't know that everyone else thinks this way that I think. And it's like, if we're all thinking this way, then doesn't that mean that we should talk about it and not just like keep it all buried inside, you know?
100%. I love all those books that you said. And one thing that I really like about reading is that it does exactly that. It does exactly that, where you start to like read about patterns that you have in your life, and you're just like, wait a second, I'm not the only person that like overly thinks about what that one person told me 2 weeks ago, and then I'm in the elevator right now,
Right.
just like thinking about that, and I leave the elevator, and then I'm like, damn, I should have said this, or damn, I should have said that, or it's like you're just constantly living in this regretful state instead of like, okay, whatever, I'm me, I'm Andrew. Like if that person accepts me or not, that's not really in my power. So
Yeah. And it allows you to just kind of take the load off yourself and being like, all right, they're like, I'm normal, right? I'm not weird by thinking this way, because other people think this way. It's just maybe we don't talk about it as much. And that's why I love that book, is that it creates that space to like, hey, maybe we can start to talk about this kind of stuff as men, or as just people in general. Like we can start to open up about these things that maybe we feel like we have to deal with on our own for some egotistical reason.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
I'm certainly gonna have to read these.
Oh,
I haven't read either of those two. So the subtle art and and everything. I had definitely need to get on those. I might go buy them today. I have a
I
Barnes and
would
Noble gift
recommend.
card.
There
The
you
subtle
go.
art bread, I
I believe.
100% like get that
Yeah,
one.
I always see it. I always see it, and it's one of those where I always like end up buying another book on training.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
ordering a book. I need to get it though for
Correct me if
sure.
I'm wrong, but I think the blue cover one is his first one, and then the orange cover is his second. So I did it in the reverse order, but I'd recommend reading Everything Is Fucked, A Story of Hope first.
Oh,
Okay.
really?
Yeah, because that's more like left brain, right brain, and how those two kind of intersect. And like subtle art of not giving a fuck. I can just flip to any chapter and reread that and understand the message in that chapter. But um, everything is fucked. A story of hope is like start to finish, like a story, you know.
Hmm.
Okay. You know what? One book that I just finished, I finished it today actually. The Motive by Patrick Lencioni. This one that
Okay.
Brett recommended to me. It was pretty good. It took me about a day to read, so it really wasn't that long. Because it's short pages and big text. So so you really
Yeah,
get to finish it quick. But like
I'll
the
have to
big
check it
thing it
out.
was talking about was like taking on too much responsibility and not getting enough done by taking on too much.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we're all guilty of that, right? Especially in this day and age of, whether it's social media showing us the perfect life of someone else, or whether it's us consistently comparing ourselves to the biggest guy in the gym or the guy that's driving a Ferrari down Brickell Ave, you know? Like we do these things where we create these problems in our head. And if we don't allow ourselves to go down that route, then we won't really fall into that pitfall. But it's something that's in all of us, right? And we all fall into it at some point.
100%. And it's like the more laser focused we could be, because like the main thing in the book was it's two CEOs having a conversation, and one guy, he's just involved in every single part of the company, and then the other guy is just like, I only do this one specific thing. And he's like, but that's the most boring part of the job. And he's like, look, like, do you want your company to be better or not?
Right. Right. Do you want to improve or do you want to stay where you are right now?
Yeah, so like little things like just like comparing your situation to somebody else, like you don't know, like that's one of the things in Miami that it can motivate you a ton, but it could also discourage you seeing all the supposed wealth. And I say supposed wealth because again, like once you start learning a little bit more about like what's actually going on, you're like, okay, maybe that's not what it is. This guy lives in a penthouse, but he has seven roommates and they split it. And like this
And
guy's
he's in
sleeping on the
credit card
couch.
debt.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Credit card debt, and like he's sleeping on the couch, but he lives in a penthouse and he drives a Ferrari, but he splits it with four other people. So it's like, okay, like yes, this is a good lifestyle, but is that the type of lifestyle that I necessarily want? It's like, no, I want certain things, but I don't want to like have to like completely handicap my life in order to get those things.
Yeah.
That's what the motive goes into as well, right? Is like shifting out of the position or the status and thinking about the real reason as to why you may want that position or status, and that gives you the drive to actually achieve it.
Right.
Yeah, and that goes into the conversation of like, all right, do we want a 100-foot long pool that's a foot deep, or do we want a 10-foot pool that's 20 feet deep, right? Depth versus length, right? Meaning
Yeah.
versus quantity, Those are some things that, you know, when I moved down here first 6 months, I was like, man, everyone is rich, really good looking, in great shape. And then you peel back the layers and you're like, oh, this is a facade. This is all a front, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it goes it the cool thing is that all that stuff ties into fitness as well because there's some people that are really jacked, but then they can't touch their shoes to bend down, or they can't bend down to tie their shoes. They can't walk up a flight of stairs without like gasping for air, or their health is
Oh,
completely in the dumps.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like, I remember you had asked me earlier, like, are we overcomplicating ourselves in training? Like, where are we going with that? And the short answer is yes. Like the amount of times that I get asked on a daily basis, like, oh, what's the most efficient way to do this? What's the most effective thing for that? What is, the easiest way to get X result? And my answer is always the same. Is always like, all right, so what are you doing other than that? What does your sleep look like? What does your nutrition look like? What are some of the other things that you are doing aside from that? Because everyone wants the quickest, the easiest, the 10-minute abs way out, but they don't see the work that's done from, you've been swimming for God knows how long, for decades. You were playing baseball for years and developing that muscle maturity, that athletic conditioning, that fitness. I've been working out for 12 years and people want to know what I do for my workouts. And I tell them it's not the same thing I was doing when I first started off. Those are two totally different conversations to have.
Yeah, and along those lines as well, as there was a study that I found very interesting, and the premise was that someone who is overweight yet exercises versus someone who is considered on weight but does not exercise. Overweight person that exercises is significantly more healthy than the other.
Yeah, the skinny fat debate, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like they've done studies where I remember in college, we looked at a study where they took just the cross-sectional area of someone's quadricep of I believe it was a 75-year-old individual, one who did triathlon training, strength training, all of that kind of stuff, but was considered overweight by the standards of, BMI, which is a garbage metric, by the way.
Yeah.
Cannot begin to, I could fill an hour with how that fails us. Versus someone that was, as you said, a healthy weight. And we see the cross-sectional area of their quadricep. The overweight guy who's supposed to be less healthy has far more muscle mass on their
Yeah.
frame and in that one cross-section than this quote unquote healthier skinny fat person might have.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I always like to ask people, and when they're going about their training program, they're like, man, I'm not losing weight. It's like, but how do you feel though? You know what I mean? Are you
Mm.
feeling better, moving better, sleeping better? Do you have more energy?
How do clothes fit, right?
Big
How do
one
we
right
perceive
there.
ourselves in the mirror, right?
And
Yeah, and that's the trickiest part with weight loss clients is they'll get very stuck on one specific number, right? The weight on the scale, how much they weigh. But they might not understand that their body might be going through a recomposition period. Like they may be getting a whole lot stronger and dropping body fat and gaining muscle mass, but unless you hop on a machine like we have that'll tell us your body fat percentage, they may look at the scale and after 3 months see no movement in that scale, or maybe it goes in the wrong direction and they just throw their hands up and they say, I quit, I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah.
but so much progress has been made.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us have fallen victim to that number on the scale. Me, I always wanted to gain more weight, and it was just like a whole thing. It's like let's get to 220, let's get to 215, let's be a beast of a man. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's like I'll look at the scale and it's one day 205, one day 200, one day 198, and it's like
Right. Yeah.
It-
I always discourage clients from weighing themselves every day too. Because the fluctuations that can happen day to day, your body can fluctuate 2 to 5 pounds just in a 24-hour span based on
100%.
water, salt, what they ate that day.
Yeah, yeah. So the number one thing we're let's because I know Brett has a client at 5. So I know Brett has a client at 5. So to start wrapping things up, let's uh let's have one line sentence of what you think moving forward would be one of the best things that you could get, one of the best advice you could give anybody who's either getting into fitness or on their journey. A one liner.
Consistency over efficiency. That would be my best piece of advice, right? I don't care about what you do each day, how you break down your training protocol, how many days a week you're hitting each body part, what you're doing when you're in the gym, as long as you're showing up every day, right? As long as you show up and put in the work, whatever that work may be, even if it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you don't have 2 hours, do you have an hour? If you don't have an hour, do you have 30 minutes, right? Showing up every day, not only for the people that you said you would show up for, but showing up for yourself and making it a commitment to your own overall health and wellness and well-being is going to far exceed the best diet plan, the best training program, the best time of day to come in. All of those are great things to look at after you solve that consistency problem.
100%. 100%. And that's a big thing I told Brett because back when we first started hanging out in person, I told him about his feet and he didn't really know any about that. He's just like, what do you mean? And I was like, look, I wouldn't tell this to people who aren't really working out, but you're already working out. You're already having a lot of fun working out. So you're going to be doing it anyway. If you're going to be doing it
Yeah,
anyway, you can focus on the little nuances. You can focus on those tiny little things because you're already doing it.
right, exactly. And like, you wouldn't start someone off with specific, arch training and small muscular feet stuff, but if they're already doing the basic stuff, then you can actually start to dive in deeper to what it is might be root cause.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been an
Yeah.
awesome
And
episode. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, it really has. It really has. No, I was just gonna say being barefoot is so like healthy because I was already doing barefoot training for 5, 6 years. You know what I mean? But then, so having strong feet is man, it's so important, man. It's the base, it's the structure, and it's neglected yet very important.
Yeah, I mean, I know a couple years ago I had big issue with plantar fasciitis. Being on my feet all day, I get like 20,000 steps a day because of, my job. And when I started implementing some things like that, where, we're taking the shoes off, we're taking the socks off, we're really getting down to the nitty gritty, that's when I actually started to figure that stuff out. After, orthotics and seeing a podiatrist and doing all this other stuff, none of that really worked. But when we started to get down to it, like, yeah, that stuff made a huge impact for me.
It's just like the concept of the Outlive book
Absolutely.
from what I heard you tell me about it. Yeah, taking control, like do the orthotic or train the feet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Get to the root cause. Don't look for band-aid solutions, right? Treat the cause, not the symptom.
Yeah, and I mean the body has the answers to everything. It's just a means of accept like one, taking initiative and two, having the mindset that change is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And convincing yourself you can do it, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, this
100%.
is
Dude, yeah, I feel like we could keep going for another 2 hours. I said
yeah,
that
Oh
honestly,
before,
man,
but
this has
I'm
been
yeah.
fired up right now.
this has been a great conversation, honestly. We went into a lot of different topics, but to close things out, Kyle, where can we find you on Instagram and where can we find you to get a training session with you?
Well, you can always find me at Equinox Brickell Heights. Of course, I live there. That's half my life, right? I've been here since 6 a.m. today, just doing my thing. Instagram is KC_fitness131. I got to get myself a little more exposure on there. I've been lacking on the content on that stuff, so this will be a good jump start. And I appreciate you guys giving me the platform to talk. Like I said, this is a bucket list thing for me, and I could go on like you guys for another 3, 4 hours talking about this kind of stuff because this is the stuff I talk about with my clients with, and I always wish I had someone there recording me.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
man, we really appreciate you coming on. It's been a great chat. And
Anytime.
yeah, man, absolutely. Yeah, we could run it back in the future.
To cap
Let's
this
do it.
off, put up your peace sign so we can get a little Instagram post. There we go. And I'm co-host Andrew Garcia. You can find me at Andrew's Not Fit because I'm not fit in the slightest. Brett, where can we find you?
Add Brett Thiem. There's 3 T's in there. Brett has 2 T's. My last name starts with a T. So put the third T in there and it'll pop up. We appreciate you guys watching to the end. Another episode of Power Talks Podcast. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
See
Peace.
you next time
Thank you guys.
in this recording.